history tends to record itself as a story of opposites. Conqueror against conquered, civilization against civilization, one god's flag raised against another's. For 7 centuries, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire had maintained a conflict that most people alive during that era had simply accepted as a permanent condition of existence, like seasons or mortality. These were the two dominant military powers of the ancient world, locked in a rivalry so deeply embedded in their identities that cooperation between them would have seemed not just improbable, but fundamentally impossible. Soldiers on both sides were raised on stories of the enemy's brutality. Generals spent entire careers learning to outthink the opposing side. It was said, in complete seriousness, that fire and water would learn to coexist before a Roman officer and a Persian one could ever call themselves allies. And yet, in the year 634 AD, the impossible quietly arranged itself into fact. Something was moving through the desert to the south. Something neither empire had encountered before, something that did not operate like any adversary they had previously known. It had shattered Persian garrison after Persian garrison. It had crossed terrain that military convention declared impassable. It had fought and triumphed under conditions, extreme heat, physical exhaustion, severe numerical inferiority that should have guaranteed its annihilation. Word spread across the frontier with a particular kind of dread. A Muslim general named Khalid ibn al-Walid had never once suffered defeat. He moved like an outcome, not a threat, as though his victories were already inscribed and the battles themselves were merely formalities. By early 634 AD, Khalid had not merely pushed the Persians back. He had methodically dismantled their ability to respond. He had secured the Euphrates corridor, crushed 3 separate Arab tribal coalitions in succession, and driven the remnants of the Persian frontier forces to the edge of their own territory. He arrived at Firaz, a fortified border settlement at the precise point where the Euphrates divided Persian-controlled land from Byzantine-held territory, intending to seal the campaign and establish a defensible boundary. What awaited him there would become the defining engagement of his military life. His scouts returned with reports that stretched credulity. Across the Euphrates, a force of extraordinary size and improbable composition was assembling. The Persian garrisons, having retreated in disarray from their successive defeats along the river, had regrouped and were resolved to make one final stand. Alongside them, the Arab Christian tribes of the frontier, the Taghlib, the Yad, the Namir, had gathered in their thousands, driven by fury after the losses they had sustained during Khalid's relentless night raids. But the detail that truly defied comprehension was this. The Byzantine frontier commanders, watching the Muslim advance with mounting alarm, had opened their own fortified gates and welcomed their centuries-long enemies inside. At Firaz, the most enduring hatred in the ancient world had dissolved overnight. What bound this coalition was not diplomacy. No formal treaties had been signed between Constantinople and Ctesiphon. This was something more primal, an alliance of survival forged by men who had watched their defenses collapse one by one and arrived at a single shared conclusion. None of them could face Khalid alone. The Arab tribal leaders carried a message between camps, sharpened through repetition. To the Romans, if you allow this man to secure the Euphrates unchallenged, he will be at the gates of Syria before summer. To the Persians, you have tested him 4 times. You already know the result without support. The arguments needed little embellishment. The evidence was visible in the ruined state of the Persian frontier. So the banners of the cross rose beside the banners of the Zoroastrian flame. Soldiers who had spent careers training to kill one another now stood in the same formation. The combined force facing Khalid across the river was enormous. Ancient historians place it above 100,000, while modern scholars estimate between 50 and 80,000. Even at the lowest figure, Khalid's 15,000 veterans were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. And that 15,000 was not the sharp-rested force that had left Medina 12 months earlier. These men were worn through, their equipment bearing the damage of a year's continuous fighting. It was Ramadan. They were fasting, no food, no water, with the weight of 2 empires assembling across the river. Khalid studied what was gathering on the opposite bank, with the calm of a man who had processed worse scenarios and survived all of them. He held a foundational conviction, inseparable from everything he did in battle. The outcome was not determined by who had more soldiers. It was determined by the clarity of purpose behind each one. The coalition commanders, settled into their enormous numbers, operated on an entirely different psychology. They held their war council with the tone of men dividing a prize not yet collected. When the time came to send the traditional pre-battle challenge, the messenger crossed to Khalid's side with a question that had opened 1,000 ancient battles. "Commander, will you bring your army across to us, or shall we come to you?" It was a trap dressed as courtesy. A river crossing against an observing enemy is among the most punishing operations in any military vocabulary. An army mid-crossing is divided, exposed, and deeply vulnerable. But receiving the crossing meant absorbing the full momentum of a force 5 to 8 times larger on ground, where there was no room to fall back. Khalid gathered his senior lieutenants and walked through the terrain, not as it was, but as it would be under different conditions. He noticed what the coalition, intoxicated by their own size, had failed to think through. If they crossed to his side, the Euphrates would sit directly at their backs. In a controlled engagement, that meant nothing. But if the battle turned against them, if panic moved through the formation, the river behind them would not be a retreat route. It would be a wall, and walls, during a rout, become graves. He returned his answer to the messenger in a single phrase: "Cross to us." The coalition commanders read it as confirmation of fear. They began preparing the crossing immediately, moving with the energy of men who believed the hardest part was behind them. Roman military engineers lashed together a bridge of boats and moved the vast formation across in organized waves. Regiment after regiment stepped onto Khalid's side of the river while his soldiers observed in complete silence. Some of them, fasting, outnumbered, watching the weight of 2 empires pour onto their bank, almost certainly felt their resolve being tested. The enemy just kept coming. Khalid repeated the same instruction with each passing hour: let them all cross. Every single one. When the last regiment had cleared the bridge, the coalition deployed across the plain of Firaz. Roman heavy infantry took the center. Persian cavalry anchored both wings. The Arab contingents filled the gaps between. From a distance, it looked decisive. It looked finished before it started. What it actually was, from Khalid's angle of observation, was a formation that had already defeated itself. The sheer scale of the army, compressed between the advancing Muslim lines ahead and the Euphrates behind, left almost no lateral room to maneuver. 3 languages competed in the air whenever a command was issued: Greek, Persian, Arabic, and 3 distinct command structures, pulled in slightly different directions, at the moments when unity mattered most. None of them had faced Khalid under conditions he had designed. The coalition horns sounded at midday. The initial collision was massive and brutal, the Muslim lines bending steadily under the weight of an army that read each forward step as proof of imminent victory. For nearly an hour, the defenders held through sheer concentrated ferocity. The Romans and Persians pressed harder, interpreting the pressure in the Muslim line as the beginning of collapse. Khalid watched from the rear. He saw what they could not see from inside the formation: the flanks were compressing inward. As the coalition pushed forward with everything it had, the outer wings curled toward the center, eliminating the space cavalry needed to operate, entangling the command structure further. He raised his hand and gave the signal his cavalry had been waiting for. The reserve split into 2 columns and swept wide around both flanks simultaneously, striking the exposed rear of the Persian and Roman wings before any warning could travel through the packed formation. Panic, once seated in a compressed mass of men, does not stay local. It moves forward like a current through water. The front ranks hesitated. In that fraction of a second, the line that had been slowly bending snapped. Caught from the front, the flanks, and the rear, the coalition army stopped being an army and became a crowd, with a river directly behind it. What followed was not a military withdrawal. It was a catastrophe. The coalition soldiers broke toward the only direction available: backward, toward the Euphrates. And what met them there was the bridge of boats they had crossed so confidently hours before. It buckled, and then failed entirely under the weight and panic of tens of thousands of men surging onto it simultaneously. Roman legionaries in full armor went into the current and did not surface. Persian cavalry horses dragged their riders under. Muslim archers worked the bank without pause until there was nothing left to engage. Every major source agrees on one striking detail: more men were taken by the river that day than by the sword. When the light finally left the sky over Firaz, the combined force of Rome, Persia, and the Arab frontier tribes had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting body. Khalid stood at the water's edge, looked at what the day had produced, and performed a single quiet act. He lifted water to his mouth, broke his Ramadan fast, and gave thanks to God. The gesture of a man who understood that what had happened that afternoon was not entirely his own doing. The Battle of Firaz closed the Iraq campaign. In just over 12 months of continuous warfare, Khalid ibn al-Walid had fought 15 major engagements and lost none of them. The combined resistance of 2 ancient superpowers had been met in open battle and destroyed in a single afternoon. But the map was already shifting elsewhere, and the campaigns ahead would demand everything the young Muslim armies had left.